Well, well, well. Who could have possibly seen this coming? Who could have possibly imagined that Nintendo would not increase the price point for the Nintendo Switch 2, that Mario Kart World would do exceedingly well, that this console would be received very warmly by the gaming community and would just do really, really well among players, among younger fans, older fans, everyone, right? Who could have possibly foreseen that this console would be a roaring success? Nobody like that exists, unfortunately. But it is really cool to finally get hard confirmation that there will be no price increase and that the pre-orders are going live, because this has been like a really weird, strange, dragged out process in which game journos tried to make a situation political. They did everything they possibly could to try and get Nintendo fans to hate Donald Trump, and it just completely fell flat on its face. Like, it was a complete and total failure in just concern trolling or manipulation, or just like trying to rattle the cattle. Like, I don't even know how to like put what they tried to do, but I think it was pretty self-evident early on that there would be no price increase due to the tariffs, that people were being overly zealous about the price. Like, people, the thing that got me early on was that, like, people acting as if Nintendo had raised prices this generation, when in reality, the industry was already talking about raising prices again anyway. And they had raised prices to $70 for this console generation. Like Grand Theft Auto 6 was already talking about like raising its price to like $100. So, like, to see the people sit there and grandstand and try to say that like Mario Kart World isn't going to be worth it, or it's not going to be as good, it's not going to be worth like $80, when like a lot of the same people, I don't want to say all of them because obviously, but like, a lot of the same people had already come out and did damage control for Grand Theft Auto 6. Like, we saw this happen. And it's very amusing to me to see like YouTubers, people who pull in like millions of dollars in views and like sponsorship deals and stuff like that, like sit there and try to pretend to be outraged over this, because it's very self-evident that like these people could afford the console, they could afford the price point, like they're only acting outraged for the views. And I do think that that's what really needs to be said, going into this shift where people gradually begin to accept that the Nintendo Switch 2 is going to be successful and that it is going to do well, is that a lot of the criticism lobbied against it was by people who have supported more expensive platforms in the past, have done nothing to talk about like good upcoming games or talk about Nintendo positively in the past. Like, they are people who are simply looking for an opportunity to grift. People who are trying to cash in on Nintendo stepping outside of their lane and producing a console that will outperform Xbox and PlayStation in specs. That is the thing here. Like, people don't really understand like how dangerous of a precedent this is setting. The idea that Nintendo can no longer be seen as like the lesser alternative, like budget platform. Because this was like how it was in the PS360 era, right? Where like Xbox and PlayStation were the premium consoles for like the big boy gamer, and then like the Nintendo console was seen as for kids, right? That was never true at any point, but that was always the narrative, right? But over time, that narrative has just completely collapsed. Not only do more Nintendo adults play Nintendo now, not only has it become more normalized, it's also like it's also become apparent just how much more high quality the Nintendo brand actually is. 10 years ago, I was talking pretty openly, actually, no, longer than that. 15 years ago, I was talking, pretty openly about how Nintendo games, no, 20 years ago. Yeah, 20 years ago, even, I was talking openly about how much better Nintendo games were than their PS2 counterparts. And at the time, I was sneered at. But the reality is, you can look back and see the GameCube and N64 era and just see how much more popular and legendary those games have become over the decades compared to their PS2 and Xbox counterparts. And the narrative has always been that, like, you're just nostalgic for it, those games aren't that good, but it's become apparent right now that that wasn't actually true. We know about the fake PS2 sales numbers. We can see how, like, games like Devil May Cry have not held up as well compared to Luigi's Mansion. Wind Waker is a all-time classic. Like, Nintendo, in a way, did more than win all of those console generations. They built up a brand, establishing themselves as the video game company. You can't really dispute this. You can't really argue this. You can't, like, claim otherwise. Nintendo is the video game company. And right now, we're still in this, like, weird process where, like, everybody's, like, refusing to accept it. Like, well, everybody has phones. People are just gonna play games on their phones. PC gaming. Like,
Unknown caller.
people are trying to continue this farce to convince us that, like, Nintendo's Nintendo's on the way out. They aren't competitive. They can't do anything. Um, that they're an alternative brand, that they're a lesser brand, that they can't remain competitive. That, like, someone's gonna swoop in and just steal their thunder, and that just never happened. In spite of the industry's best efforts to prop up PlayStation, Xbox, PC gaming, mobile, like, all of that has just kind of collapsed among the reality of the situation is that Nintendo is a perpetually growing company. All of their products are exceedingly high quality, and they're expanding into avenues outside of gaming, such as theme parks and movies. The giant cope that people had back in the 2000s that, like, well, Sony and Microsoft are bigger companies, has just completely fallen flat on its face. We have seen how being involved with other aspects of the tech industry dilutes the core product of video games. This is a pretty common cope when it comes to PC gamers in particular, was that, like, well, you can do a lot more on a PC than console, completely ignoring the fact that consoles are cheaper products that focus entirely on video games. If all you want to do is play games, Nintendo consoles are superior. And if you want a PC for, like, Microsoft Word or whatever, like I do, like, that's a completely different thing and does not cut into Switch sales or its relevancy at all. And this is the current state of the situation, is that Nintendo has not only won the console war, they have reached the point where, like, a lot of the old copes that have been levied against them for decades aren't going to stick anymore. You can't complain about the power. You can't complain about the price point. You can't complain about the IPs. Like, I remember 20 years ago, that was really common. Is that, like, Nintendo doesn't make new IPs, and now it's more commonly understood that that's not true. Like, anybody who tries that shit today gets laughed at. The Nintendo Switch 2 is, I think, I've been saying this, like, I think even before the console came out, was announced, but, like, it is going to be the last stand for a lot of, like, traditional copes when it comes to Nintendo. Like, the pretendo copes, we should call them. The idea that the company is just, all of its successes are just flukes, or that people just buy it out of nostalgia, and that it's not that good or competitive. That will not be able to sustain itself in a world where they can put out back-to-back, like, major console success stories like the Switch and the Switch 2. They the entire narrative of acting as if, like, Nintendo hardware is obsolete, or that it can't compete, like, it's going to completely fall apart. Like, I what's going to happen going forward is that the Switch 2 is going to do well. And much like the Switch 1 in 2017, there's going to be this very long period of just people just refusing to acknowledge it, just refusing to admit it, to pretend as if like Baldur's Gate 3 is somehow more relevant, that From Slop is doing better than ever, that PlayStation is going to like, that Xbox is going to put out their gaming handheld, Steam, like, the Steam Deck is a big thing among these people. Like they're going to do everything they possibly can, and eventually, it's going to become harder and harder to do to pretend that Nintendo is not some major cultural icon. There are no major PlayStation IPs on the same level as Mario, Zelda, or Pokemon. There is not going to be some major revival of the Xbox brand. Mobile and PC have established that they are not competitors in this space. And right now, all we're seeing is just excuses and made up narratives by a group of aging millennial YouTubers and Gandros.